You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
And that one big beautiful bill will include securing the border, restoring America's energy dominance, dismantling the deep state, and a return to peace through strength.
The big beautiful bill that takes a wrecking ball to the US budget went through the House, but what happens now? And will all the Republicans get behind their President Trump's radical reforms? Also ahead, Taiwan's Army, Navy and Air Force are sent to fend off threats from China. Are the two sides upping the ante? We'll hear the latest from the European Fashion Weeks and explore the latest ideas to help nurture the return to the office. Plus the newspapers and...
Hello, Emma. Today I'll give you a culture roundup of delights, from the return of Manchete magazine to this weekend's award ceremonies.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco joins me in the studio to bring us the latest cultural headlines. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US President Donald Trump says Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will sign what he called a very big agreement in the US on Friday, granting them access to Ukraine's mineral resources. The White House has also denied reporters from news organizations access to President Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, in keeping with the administration's new policy regarding media coverage. And France is to review a decades-old agreement that makes it easier for Algerian citizens to move to France, unless Algeria agrees to take back those who are deported by the French authorities. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill, which effectively takes a chainsaw to the US budget, passed the House of Representatives this week. It contains proposals to cut $4.5 trillion in taxes, about $2 trillion in spending, and allocates hundreds of billions of dollars more for the military and for border security. It now has to be reconciled with a Senate bill that has already been passed. So to tell us more about what all these enormous numbers mean for America and also what happens next, I'm joined now in the studio by Monocle's senior news editor, Chris Chermak. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Very good to have you with us in the studio. Look, let's just try and work out what $4.5 trillion in tax cuts actually looks like.
If you want to start with the tax cuts, what's particularly interesting is this does not include the Trump tax cuts from back in his first term. So this is one of the things that we still don't know exactly. It would not be enough to actually cover the Trump tax cuts from the first term, but this is one of the many open questions that we can discuss in this bill, because there's basically a lot of numbers at this point thrown around without the actual detail in there in terms of where the spending cuts exactly are going to be, and to that point, where exactly the tax cuts are going to be. If Trump's tax cuts are part of this, then that's $4.5 trillion right there. If not, then they have a lot of other taxes they're cutting as well.
So this is still, these are not entirely binding numbers, are they? They are still pretty vague. But the effect on the US budget and the effect on the US economy would be profound.
Well, it's more that the numbers, if you will, if this bill were to be reconciled with the Senate's bill or passed in its current form by the Senate, then the numbers would be fixed, right? You'd be saying we want to cut $4.5 trillion in taxes, cut $2 trillion in spending. The question then is, though, how you do it, what gets cut? And therein lies the wrinkle. And there are many examples already of the problems around that. What's been interesting for me is you listen to some, whether it's senators or even Mike Johnson of the House, or even Elon Musk for that matter, when they talk about some of these things, they try to pass it off as, well, we're going to go after fraud, waste, efficiency. So, for example, when it comes to health spending cuts, which would be about $880 billion of these $2 trillion in theory, there's a worry that that would go into Medicaid, which is health aid for the poorer Americans, for example, subsidies for health insurance. But Mike Johnson says, no, this isn't at all about cutting anyone's benefits at all. We are going to find those $880 billion in efficiencies and waste. So this is where it's going to be interesting as they continue in these negotiations. Are they actually going to lay this out? Are they going to say really where this cuts are coming from? Or are they going to act like this can all be done through waste and efficiency?
This bill has gone through the House just about, because the Republicans have the narrowest of majorities in the House, don't they? So this bill, despite the Republicans having both control of the House and the Senate, this didn't get through easily, did it?
It did not get through easily. It only got through by 217 to 215 votes, which shows just how difficult this is. This is in part because you have deficit hawks within the Republican majority, the slim majority that they have in the House as well. And senators have already said that no, they are not going to pass the bill as it is, that they want to make major changes to it as well. One of the many things that are under discussion is whether a debt ceiling would be, whether there would be a debt ceiling increase as part of this. This is about whether the government is allowed to even pay debts to pay its creditors once they reach a certain ceiling in debt. This is something that many deficit hawks do not want. So there will be plenty of discussions going forward. And yes, House Speaker Mike Johnson has tried to say, well, we have this really slim majority. Please just pass our bill. But senators are not going to go for that.
This is a really difficult situation for the Republicans, isn't it? Because clearly they are happy to be back in power, but back in power under Donald Trump isn't the most straightforward of situations.
It isn't, and I think what's interesting is this is the moment where, if you will, Congress is reasserting itself at least a little bit. These things have to be passed. Until now, we've basically seen everything happen through executive orders of the Trump administration or the actions of Elon Musk and Doge when it comes to trying to slim governments and agencies. Now, this is the moment for Congress to say, how much are we actually going to spend? Where are the cuts going to come from? And it'll be very interesting to see this interplay going forward. Is Trump going to say, just pass the bill as I want it? Or are senators and House members going to stand up and say, no, these are the actual cuts we want, and these are the cuts we want you to make?
Just explain a little bit about what happens now. The idea that it has to be reconciled with a Senate bill that's already been passed. What does that mean?
Exactly. So basically at this point, both the House and the Senate have passed a bill, but they have to pass the same bill. So now they go into negotiations, and these will be negotiations between the House, between the Senate, and with the White House. So already next week, you're going to see the Senate and House leaders go to the White House to then figure out what exactly are we going to do with this bill? How can we move forward? And this is something that could take weeks. It could still take months, potentially. There is a government shutdown deadline of the 13th of March, but even the House is already saying they're going to pass another continuing resolution, something else to keep the government funded in the meantime, because this bill will not be passed by then.
That is a domestic financial situation in the United States. Let us talk a little bit more about USAID. There's an excellent article in the Financial Times today, which talks about the suspension of billions in USAID, and it says has brought the global development sector to its knees. It has several on-the-ground accounts of people in all parts of the world, in all walks of life, who are being genuinely affected by the cut of USAID. There is a development on that in the last few hours, isn't there?
There is, because USAID has been one of the things cut most drastically since Donald Trump came into office, led by Elon Musk and his Doge team. USAID has essentially been folded into the State Department under Marco Rubio, and they've been looking at basically cutting the entire agency and its funding. What you've had as a result of that, with many other actions, frankly, from the Trump administration, you've had this go to the courts. And so you had a lower court that basically said the Trump administration had to pay aid agencies the $2 billion or so that they were owed for work already done, and they had a deadline of last night to pay that. The Supreme Court in the last few hours intervened on that and is giving the Trump administration a little bit more time, because they claim they've finished their review, essentially. They know now what they want to cut on USAID. And to your point of the Financial Times article as well, the State Department has, as part of this court ruling, said they have identified 92% of USAID funds that will be canceled as a result of their review. 8% will remain, which just goes to show you how incredibly drastic the cuts are when it comes to foreign funding in the United States. And then when it comes to those 8%, it's still a question of exactly when any aid agencies are going to be paid for the work that they've done.
You mentioned Elon Musk. Present in the room for Trump's first cabinet meeting. Not present in the room were Reuters, HuffPost and Tagesspiegel. They weren't allowed to go into the room. What does this say about the shift of the balance in power now in the White House?
We have seen a shift in power. There's no question about that. Elon Musk is not a member of Donald Trump's cabinet. Nevertheless, he was present for this very first meeting of Trump's cabinet, and he was the first person to speak after Donald Trump himself, who gave an opening statement talking about Ukraine and other measures. Volodymyr Zelensky will be at the White House on Friday. And then it was the turn of Elon Musk, who talked about identifying $1 trillion in cuts to the federal budget through his measures to slim the government's workforce, which has been the other major story of this week. That would be about 15% of the budget that he claims he can find. This despite him saying he is tech support and not something beyond that. He made that point in his opening statement to the cabinet. He's there to help. Nonetheless, he is going to cut 15% of the US budget while doing that.
Thank you for that, Chris. You're going to be hosting the briefing a little bit later on today. Top story is going to be, unless the world changes, and it can, is going to be the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer heading to Washington. That's a big moment, isn't it, with Starmer trying to be the bridge between the US and the EU?
It is a big moment. Also, after Emmanuel Macron, of course, was at the White House this week, European leaders trying to assert themselves in some way into negotiations over Ukraine and Russia. We'll also be looking at the Monocle magazine and a particular story about France's nuclear fusion efforts.
Chris, thank you so much for that. Chris will be live here on Monocle Radio from midday London time with the briefing. But for now, you're listening to The Globalist. Just nudging 15:12 in Taipei, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, Taiwan has dispatched its Army, Navy and Air Force to the south of the island. It follows the launch by China of a series of live fire exercises close enough to Taiwan to raise the alarm. The two nations have already been enduring heated exchanges after an undersea communications cable to the southwest of Taiwan was severed earlier this week. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now from Taipei by William Yang. A very good afternoon to you, William.
Thank you for having me again.
So this is the latest episode in, 3 years of openly hostile exchanges. The fact that the Taiwanese are dispatching the Army, Navy and Air Force to the south of the island, at what level of seriousness are we here?
So I think the reason why Taiwan was prompted to deploy dozens of its military aircraft and naval vessels to monitor the situation was because the exercise was announced basically took place without prior announcement, which was very similar to the similar military exercises that China conducted in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand over the weekend, which both countries also accused China of not providing prior warning or notification, which forced dozens of flights to be diverted. And because the area that China conducted the fire shooting training south of Taiwan was also along a very important commercial trading route for a lot of the shipping to go through. So that's why Taiwan has taken more serious measures and at the same time accused China of provocation, and also a very dangerous move that is essentially going to disrupt the international trading.
We also have this issue of the severed cable. Tell us what's happened there.
Right. So the chief of the ship that has been detained by Taiwan's Coast Guard is now under investigation in Taiwan. But this initial information about the ship already suggests that this is a typical dark fleet that China has been using for years around Taiwan to serve important communication infrastructure. Several months ago, a similar situation also happened to two undersea cables connecting Taiwan's main island to the offshore island of Matsu, where another Chinese operated ship under a foreign flag was also found to be hovering around the region before the severing of the undersea cable. So this has definitely prompted the Taiwanese government and also the Taiwanese Coast Guard to increase their vigilance and also their awareness, as well as their capabilities to really increase the monitoring capabilities of these type of ships operating around Taiwan, because we have identified more and more Chinese-operated, Chinese-owned ships that are operating under different African country flags over the last few months that are just lingering around different parts of Taiwan and oftentimes stopping right above very important communication infrastructure that essentially could fit into a scenario of China's ability of cutting Taiwan off from the outside world when they decide to impose a military blockade or even as a prelude to a full military invasion.
There is a sense, isn't there, that you have the live military drills and, as you said, the threat, the knowledge that if necessary, China could cut Taiwan off. How much is that actually felt on the streets?
I think because of the government's efforts to become very transparent with all these incidents and sharing as much information and detail as possible, not only with the Taiwanese public, but also with the international community. So I think there is a general increase of awareness among the Taiwanese population about the activities and the behavior that China has been displaying around Taiwan in recent years. Like you said, since August 2022, there has been a very serious uptick, and it almost feels like it has become part of the daily life for Taiwanese people. But so far, we have not seen the public opinion really turning into more panic mode or turning into something that, like these type of events will immediately trigger them into like crisis mode. But we are definitely seeing the Taiwanese people become more aware, and there is, I think, a general support for the government's efforts to make sure that Taiwan remains safe and also remains secure under these type of increased activities conducted by the Chinese military, but also by Chinese civilian ships.
William Yang on the line from Taipei. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Still to come.
Chris Lord, I'm very pleased to say, picked up the trowel and started laying the brickwork for this very fine business section, focusing on what property developers are up to. And what are they up to, Chris?
Well, I don't know. I didn't take a T-square with me, Andrew, so it's a bit. some of the walls are a bit askew, but it does come together in the end, and you can get through the door.
Monocle's Chris Lord and Editor-in-Chief Andrew Tuck flip through the pages of the latest Monocle magazine. This is A Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
.18 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Paul Waldy, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. Good morning, Paul. How's life in the Waldy world?
It's fine, thank you. Good morning.
What are you up to?
Well, not too much. I'm here, and I'm here bright and early to talk to you about tariffs and Trump and all the great things that are happening in the world.
Goodness help us all. One thing I do want to mention is that what is regularly noticed when the newspaper reviewers come in is they usually come in with paper, it being the newspaper review. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul has no notes, which is astonishing.
I have no notes. I do have a phone, which has a bunch of notes on it, but no, I don't have any paper notes.
We're not allowed phones in here. So this is all coming from Paul's head, ladies and gentlemen. It's impressive
Such
stuff.
as it is.
Right, let's talk about Keir Starmer on a plane to Washington to try to be, as we mentioned earlier on with Chris Chermak, the bridge between the US and the EU. He is going to say that the United States needs to take a more serious security view of the situation in Ukraine. What's the reception going to be like? Because he can't be the buddy-buddy charmer that Macron was. That's just not Starmer's style.
He can't be, but it looks as though he has some kind of relationship with Trump based on what Trump has said in the past. So perhaps it might be fairly straightforward for Starmer. But no, it's going to be very, very difficult because we're already hearing from Trump yesterday after his meeting with Macron that he wants Europe to take the lead on security for this peace deal that he's trying to bring together with Russia and Ukraine. He doesn't want the U.S. to be part of that now. He has talked about the U.S. being in Ukraine once they strike this minerals deal, but that's not going to be any kind of a military operation as far as we know. So Trump wants to leave this to Europe. Europe probably is not so keen on doing it all by itself. And I think Starmer somehow is going to be caught in the middle of this, trying to pull Trump towards some kind of role or some kind of military role in keeping the peace.
And the interesting thing here is that Keir Starmer suddenly becomes a representative of Europe.
I know he does. Well, I mean, I think he has said that the UK would certainly be willing to contribute some kind of force to a peacekeeping operation in conjunction with Europe, obviously. But yes, it is an interesting position for Starmer to be in. Now, of course, Putin has made it very clear he doesn't want any NATO troops in Ukraine at all. So I don't know how all that is going to play out with this. But it looks like for now anyway that Starmer's got a pretty big challenge on his hand, because not only is he talking about Ukraine, he's also going to be trying to talk Trump out of imposing tariffs on the UK. So there's an awful lot at stake in this meeting.
Just explain to us a little bit about how the rest of the world is seeing this. I mean, because people were observing Macron and the body language and, you know, the little devices he deploys with his hands to ensure that there's a sort of, that physical non-verbal communication control game that we get. Keir Starmer doesn't necessarily project enormously. And also we need to think, going back to one of his predecessors, Theresa May, when Trump took May's hand in the Rose Garden and very much was the dominant force in here. One wonders how Britain physically is going to assert itself in the room with Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course, Starmer comes into this meeting with a whole bunch of people who have been intensely critical of Trump over the years. Now, you know, Macron did this back when Trump was first in office, and Macron's one of the few G7 leaders who's still around from that era, and he tried to play buddy-buddy with Trump then. It had mixed success, and it's showing mixed success this time, too. I'm not sure Trump likes to be upstaged or likes to have somebody else sort of, take the shine from him during these meetings. So Macron's treading a pretty fine line here. I think Starmer's approach of kind of more businesslike might actually be more effective if he lets Trump take the lead and still makes his point somehow.
Let's move to your paper, to the Globe and Mail. Canada, in the meantime, while Europe and the Ukrainian situation is dominating the headlines, Canada is desperately trying to avoid the imposition of 25% tariffs.
It is. And there's another delegation of ministers and the country's new fentanyl czar heading down to the U.S. to try and head off 25% tariffs that might take effect next week, although Trump has somehow signaled that this might not happen until April. But I mean, I really think it's hard to underestimate or underplay for an audience outside of Canada just how anxious, angry, and really concerned Canadians are about this. I mean, I was in Toronto last week buying some clothes, and the person behind the cash register, all they wanted to talk about was tariffs and Trump and just the fear in Canada about this and the real anger that Trump wants to annex Canada somehow and make it the 51st state and keeps calling the prime minister the governor. And I think it's really struck a nerve in Canada, and there's a real sense that Canadians need to do something to retaliate beyond just maybe tariffs. So, I think this is an effort by the federal government to try and head these tariffs off, but it's difficult because I don't think Canada really knows what Trump wants, because the flow of fentanyl to the U.S. is minuscule. The flow of illegal migrants to the U.S. is minuscule. And these are the two things Trump seems to be signaling that have to be corrected before the tariffs can be lifted. So it's really unclear what Canada can do, if anything.
So do we know what they will be saying or what cards they do have to play?
They have very few cards, and they'll be saying, look, there's hardly any fentanyl going into the U.S. I think it's 0.02% of all U.S. sort of fentanyl seizures come from Canada. And the number of illegal migrants flowing from Canada is tiny compared to, Mexico and other places. So it's very difficult because these are simple facts, but Trump seems to keep moving the goalposts all the time in terms of what it will take.
Does Canada have anything to offer? I mean, we've looked at Ukraine offering the minerals deal. We've looked at the United Kingdom upping its defence spending. And what we're talking deals again. What's Canada got?
Well, I mean, Canada has, in fentanyl, they've appointed a fentanyl czar, which Trump wanted. They've spent $1.3 billion improving border security, which Trump wanted. Beyond that, there's not much Canada can do. Canada can retaliate with its own tariffs on U.S. products, but it's a pretty uneven relationship because Canada depends far more on the U.S. than the U.S. does on Canada. However, it is still a $1 trillion a year trade relationship, and the U.S. will be affected if they do this, but Canada's going to hurt a lot more.
Talking about hurting and staying with Trump, an article in the Financial Times. Donald Trump has threatened to slap 25% tariffs on imports from the EU, lashing out at the bloc, saying it was formed to screw the United States. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. This is really serious.
It is. It's yet another example. Now, we've known for a while that Trump has been aiming some kind of tariffs at the EU, and now he's kind of made it official. He hasn't said when or how or what. It seems to be 25% across the board. This seems to be the number he likes. This will affect, obviously, the EU substantially because, the U.S. is a major trading partner, particularly for countries like Germany, which have huge auto trade with the U.S. So this is going to be a big deal. It has been expected. But again, it's really unclear what Trump would want to alleviate this. And the fact that he's railing against the EU as being set up to screw the U.S., I think only hardens his position. So I think the EU might even be in a worse position than Canada because it's very difficult to understand what it is the EU can do to stop this from happening.
It is saying that it will react firmly and immediately against unjustified barriers to free and fair trade. The speed at which the European Commission doesn't necessarily help it. But the fact remains is that we are looking possibly at what the FT is describing as just a transatlantic trade war that will damage everybody.
It will. And I mean, you're now going to have trade wars with the U.S. and Canada, Mexico, the EU and China. And these are the U.S.'s biggest trading partners by far. So yes, it's going to have an impact on world trade, but it really will have an impact on the U.S. as well. And the U.S. consumer is going to feel it. And the U.S. consumer is already feeling inflation going up. So I'm not really sure how this ends or where this ends, but it's certainly not going to be it's going to be an interesting few months, that's for sure.
Spending may have a pause placed on it on Friday. There's an article in the Washington Post where we're being urged not to go shopping.
Yes, American consumers are being urged to hold off on all spending on Friday as a way of kind of demonstrating annoyance, I guess, concern, outrage at the rising prices and at sort of what this guy says is corporate greed. It's an interesting group, and it's kind of gotten a lot of traction on social media. It's claims not to be political and wants to just simply be aimed at the business community, and the fact that people are really angry that prices are not going down. Inflation is still ticking up and consumer confidence in the U.S. has really tanked, and people are worried about inflation going up even further. So this is kind of a social movement. Whether it has any impact or not remains to be seen. But if it starts a series of these kinds of protests, I think that would be a concern for U.S. business.
Apart from the fact that it is pretty bad for business if you have shop workers who don't have anything to sell.
Well, that is the flip side of this, that you're actually going to punish the people working there. But I think the bigger aim is at the big companies, Amazon, Walmart, these kinds of huge players, and saying to them, look, it's time to kind of stop gouging the consumer and start reining in prices.
Paul Waldie, thank you as ever. No notes, ladies and gentlemen. He did that off the top of his head. It's 7:27 here in London. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. And look now at what else we're following today. The US President Donald Trump says Ukraine's President Zelensky will sign what he called a very big agreement in the US on Friday, granting America access to Ukraine's mineral resources. Mr. Trump says he's not planning to grant Ukraine any extensive security guarantees, saying that's the job of Europe. However, Volodymyr Zelensky says security guarantees are essential to any deal. Hamas has handed over the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages in return for the release of 600 Palestinian prisoners. The first phase of a ceasefire is due to end this week, with no clear idea of the extension. France is to review a decades-old agreement that makes it easier for Algerian citizens to move to France, unless Algeria agrees to take back those who are deported by the French authorities. The relationship between Paris and Algiers has worsened after an Algerian citizen whom France had tried unsuccessfully to repatriate killed 1 person and injured 3 in a knife attack in the city of Mulhouse. And the White House has denied reporters from Reuters and other news organisations access to President Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, in keeping with the administration's new policy regarding media coverage. The White House denied access to an Associated Press photographer and 3 reporters from Reuters, HuffPost and the German newspaper Der Tagesspiegel. And those are the headlines on The Globalist. Let's have a look at another story that Monocle is following at the moment. It concerns the carmaker giant Stellantis. Here's Monocle's Paris bureau chief Simon Bouvier, who brings us his take on the enormous car company's search for a new CEO.
Yesterday, Stellantis, the French, Italian and American automotive behemoth, published its first financials since the ousting of former CEO Carlos Tavares. And what the numbers had to say confirmed investor concerns. Turnover was down 17% in 2024 compared to the year before, and the double-digit profit margins that were Tavares' mantra are gone. John Elkann, the president of Stellantis and representative of the group's largest shareholder as the Agnelli clan's leading man, is taking his time to name a replacement for Tavares, whose ruthless pursuit of cost-cutting led to his downfall and arguably Stellantis' current predicament. The challenges ahead for the constructor are huge, especially in the United States, where sales have collapsed. But there is reason to be hopeful that the automaker can get its mojo back. Tavares' uncompromising profitability drive strains Stellantis' relationships with key business partners, including some suppliers and dealers. But Elkann has already begun smoothing things over with them and announced a $5 billion U.S. investment plan that will help get sales back on track and should keep Stellantis off of the White House's offshoring naughty list. More importantly, new versions of the products that customers know and love from the group's big brands are coming, from the rugged Jeep Compass to Fiat's iconic Panda. In the EV arena, where sales have slowed throughout the auto industry, Stellantis' smart tie-up with China's Leap Motors is sure to pay dividends at a time when competitors are fearful of well-made and affordable plug-in vehicles made in China. Elkann has a history of making game-changing CEO picks. So whoever he ends up appointing as Stellantis' boss, it's a safe bet that his choice will be a shrewd one. But what matters even more to Stellantis' fortunes is getting back to putting product first. No short-term profit margin is worth hollowing out your brands. They need their four-wheeled ambassadors to be at their best to thrive in the long run.
That was Monocle's Simon Bouvier there. Now for a bit more in-house news on The Globalist. The March edition of Monocle magazine is on newsstands today, and it's a special about urbanism and design that includes our very own property survey for 2025. Chris Chermack sat down with our editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck and executive editor Chris Lord, and Andrew kicked things off.
Let's head up my alley, as it were. So yes, up my alley is the world of urbanism, because I like how cities are made. I run the Urbanist show, and we'll be going to MIPIM in a couple of weeks' time, which is the big trade fair in Cannes, which is all about property developers, buildings, how cities are developing, how countries are developing by using their built environment. And it's a really important trade fair. And now, the last couple of years before that, we've run this property special looking at, why developers matter, how they're shaping our cities. And this year, Chris Lord, I'm very pleased to say, picked up the baton, or picked up the trowel and started laying the brickwork for this very fine business section, focusing on what property developers are up to. And what are they up to, Chris?
Well, I don't know. I didn't take a T-square with me, Andrew, so it's a bit. some of the walls are a bit askew, but it does come together in the end, and you can get through the door. But look, I think the main thing that I think comes together with this, and was sort of a guiding light of putting it together, was that I think more and more the most interesting property developers out there are thinking more and more about the building that they're essentially developing, that they're funding, that they're working with architects to build, does not exist in isolation, that it has to be mindful of the neighbourhood around it. And I think that sort of guiding light is found across the survey. It kicks off with 10 buildings that our correspondents around the world have found for us, and there really are an amazing selection of buildings. And this section is called The Buildings That Made Their Neighbourhood. So this idea that each of these spaces somehow did something or brought something very, very unique to the area around it. And it runs a gamut from a sort of community pool in New Westminster, which is near the Pacific coast of Canada, right through to probably my favourite building, which in a way is almost like not typical Monocle architecture fair in a way, but it's the Henderson, which is right in the CBD of Hong Kong, one of the last buildings designed by Zaha Hadid, and it's this incredible sort of orchid shape right there in the CBD. And I think, in a way, what the story is about is for some years, like many cities, Hong Kong has struggled with quite high vacancy rates for its offices, which, in the CBD, the beating heart of Asian finance, struggling to get people to come back to the office. And then this mad-looking building that also is so interconnected with all the parks and transit networks that are around Hong Kong has almost acted as this beacon for a kind of new idea of the CBD and trying to bring people back. And it's just thinking about, when we talk about property development, that it's not just about a single edifice. It's like what it does to the area around it.
And Andrew, when we hear there about things like vacancy rates in certain CBDs around the world, this is obviously something of a legacy still of the pandemic. And we've had this discussion before about kind of the ideal neighborhood, how that's changed, moving residential into downtown where businesses used to be, all of that stuff. Do you feel like that discussion is settled at this point?
Well, I think that's the whole nature of property development. It's never really settled. It's always an ongoing a story. At the moment, we're seeing that some of the best, most vibrant CBDs are actually doing quite well. But here in London, we have some of the highest rates ever for commercial property in the City of London, as people try to upgrade the spaces they have, to pull back in staff, to ensure that they have a place that says something about their brand. But in other places, it's weak. And you're certainly seeing, again, here in the City of London, if you'd gone out 20 years ago of an evening, you'd have seen nobody around after about 8 o'clock, because everyone would be on their trains going home or heading into the West End. Now there's actually quite a vibrant club scene, bar scene, as it were, or restaurant scene. And we were there the other night for an event at a place called the Ned, and it was packed, the city. And you realise how these places have had to change to attract people in. So always an ongoing story. And interesting, Chris, just on that, and I'm sure we'll pick this up at MIPIN, lots of people now designing buildings that can be fixed, changed, adapted more easily, because we can't be in this situation where we build a building that's so fixed that when it comes to a bit of slight change of use, have to knock it down and start again.
And Andrew, just one other aspect as well that I know you highlighted in your opener to this magazine, which is a car-free neighborhood outside of Phoenix, Arizona. That's also a different type of change to a residential neighborhood, particularly for the United States.
Well, I shouldn't really be taking the glory, because, again, this is a story that Chris found, but it's a company called Cul-de-sac, and they've come up with a formula for building walkable neighborhoods. And what's interesting is, that they found that actually people were quite keen to go there. Our writer is cautious, because they do say that there's rumours that some people who live in the walkable neighbourhood do have cars parked elsewhere,
just outside it.
Well, yeah, and it's a complicated thing, but at least the neighbourhood is walkable, and people are walking.
It gives you a different feel.
Yeah, and when you see the pictures, it's compact. It's not vast expanses between buildings, because the weird thing about the US is oddly, many Americans would like to live like this, but the way that codes are laid down in cities, you have to have X number of parking spots per building. People don't want to be building expensive underground car parks, so they build a big parking lot and then the next apartment building. So you go to actually quite interesting, vibrant cities where it feels like a third of the space is given over to car parks and tarmac. So it's a nudging here about changing building codes, thinking differently.
But what struck me from Tom's report, coming back from Cul-de-sac, was it talks about really how there is actually, opinion polls show, Americans want to live in walkable cities, neighbourhoods and so on. Tom does identify a couple of communities that are popping up around the US, and I should say cul-de-sac are now starting to take their model to other cities. Atlanta, Georgia is another one. But there are other communities that are thinking of ways where the driveway becomes a more of a communal lawns area where you can create community on it and so on. And, we pitched this survey a little bit at developers. It's also at those people who do build buildings. And so if I was a developer reading that, and many working in America right now in these very fast-growing cities with housing crises that need more spaces for people to live. One of the things I would take away from it is there is a hunger to live in a different way. It's pitched by Cul-de-sac as European-style living. I don't know if we can really call it that, but it is a different way that is just totally not the way that America's cities has grown since the mid-century.
Well, of course, Chris Lord there, ending that conversation with Andrew Tuck and Chris Chermak about the new edition of Monocle magazine. It is a delightful, sunny, bright yellow. You can spot it easily at newsstands from today. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. The time is, 8:38 in Milan, which is where we head now for an update on Fashion Week. Natalie Theodosi is Monocle's fashion director. She joins us now from Milan. A very good morning to you, Natalie. How's Milan looking?
Good morning. Milan is grey, quite rainy, but a lot of exciting things going on. So all great from here.
Plenty of excitement. The Fendi 100-year anniversary show was absolutely sublime. It had this wonderful sense of looking backwards, but terribly forward-thinking. Very much a family affair.
Exactly. I had a very good feeling the moment that I received the invitation at the beginning of the week, which was this beautiful leather-bound photo album with black and white pictures of the Fendi family. And that's how it felt last night as well. Sylvia Fendi's grandchildren opened the show, and you then just had this beautiful lineup of models from across different generations that have been working with Fendi over the years. And what I found also quite interesting is that usually with anniversaries, the designer looks back at the archive, sometimes almost copies and pastes different looks. But that didn't happen here. You barely saw the Fendi logo or even too many of the really famous iconic bags that Sylvia Fendi is known for. It was just something that was really elegant and refined, and I think really paid homage to Italian glamour and style, which is what the Fendi women are known for.
Indeed, the pared down aspect of that, of Italian glamour, because it has a scale, doesn't it, does Italian dressing for women? And Fendi just elevated it to something that was, the understatement was, it was very loud, if that could be possible.
Exactly. It did feel like you say, an elevated version of the kind of Milanese women that you see walking down the streets, and they were coming out of this large wooden door. So there was this element of reality to it, definitely.
We also have a sort of a slightly backwards looking is never a nice thing to say about fashion, but a sort of a retrospective feel to the Gucci show as well.
Absolutely. They called it a sprezzatura. Given that Gucci doesn't have a creative director at the moment, the idea was to look at different moments of the brand beyond a creative director and all the different parts that make it up, whether it's the artisans, previous creative directors, elements of its heritage, and just bring it together. I think, just like last time when the brand was in this transition, the collections can feel a little bit confused when you do that. And it goes to show that even though the role of the creative director is changing, a luxury brand does need a figurehead to lead a collection and its direction.
It does. I mean, where is Gucci sitting at the moment? Because I think that there is. How hard is it crying out for a new leader?
I think every brand that is, including Gucci, definitely, that doesn't have a leader at the moment is desperately crying out for one. And it's also brands don't have creative directors, but some of them are looking for CEOs as well. I think that's equally critical. Gucci does now have a newly appointed CEO, Stefano Cantino, who will be shaping the direction. And I think the idea is for them to keep going with the rebrand that they had started that focuses a lot more on heritage, on this kind of more classic approach to design. But without Sabato De Sarno on the lead, they had to take away a lot of the signatures that we were just about to become familiar with and rethink everything again. So I think now even more than before, they need someone with a really strong vision to shake up the brand and give it finally a clear direction.
And identity is such an enormous part of fashion. But what seems to be the case at the moment is change is the only thing which is constant in fashion. I mean, we're looking at the Jill Sander show. Luke and Lucy Meyer, they took their final bow on the catwalk and now they're gone.
Exactly. I mean, you could feel it a little bit. The collection was all black. We were sitting in this pitch black box, and they came out. They did a slightly longer final bow that they usually do. They looked a little bit stern and emotional. So, and then just a few hours later, the announcement about their exit was released to everyone. So it's quite a tense atmosphere as well, going to some of these shows, speaking to the people involved. But on a positive note, they did show a really beautiful final collection that I think will sell very well and then keep Jill Sander going for a while.
Let's touch as well briefly, if we can, on the likes of Bali and Versace as well. They too are in a state of flux. I mean, one wonders who's actually sort of sitting comfortably at the moment. In Italy, at least.
Across Italy and France, the changes are ongoing. I think we're going to have to see a few more. And fashion's HR departments just have been busier than ever. Bali is happening this afternoon with their show. And again, even though they seemed like they had found their stride with this new designer, Simone Bellotti, now again, the incoming CEO is talking about restructuring. They've really scaled down the size of the show. So it will be interesting to see what happens this afternoon. Same with Versace, looking for a new buyer. It could be Prada, which is great news, but we have to wait and see.
Monocle's Natalie Theodosi, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Milan. You're with The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now, it's about 5 years since much of the world was still going about its business, but the COVID lockdowns were being imposed in the likes of China. The pandemic temporarily stopped the world. But arguably the only noticeable changes that we have seen have been to the world of work. Coupled with the establishment of AI and lots of what we do, there are plenty of questions to be asked about what the office means nowadays. And it seems that there are multiple answers, and not all of them suiting everybody. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now on the line from San Francisco by David Gallulo, who's CEO, Chief Creative Officer at Wrapped Studio, which deals with helping enormous companies work out what to do with their offices. A very good evening to you, David.
Hi, nice to be here.
There is this sense, isn't there, that companies are really lost when it comes to what needs to be done about the office and what its purpose is now, isn't there?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of paralysis that has happened, and even the term "return to office" seems to not be aging well, because we're not going back. You know, what we learned when we were sent home in 2020 about ourselves and our relationship with work needs to be incorporated in new tools in how we engage with the workplace, with each other, with our jobs, and with ourselves.
It doesn't necessarily chime. Not everybody agrees with that, though, doesn't there? There's a very sort of strong sense by very large parts of the world that in order to make an organisation live and breathe and thrive, you all need to be together. But we've seen JP Morgan telling everybody to be back into the office Monday to Friday. Is there more a sense that people are delivering the message that you need to be back in an office incorrectly when actually you could turn it into something rather wonderful?
Yeah, I think frankly, I think the one thing we've learned is blanket statements and one size fits all does not work, which is hard for large organizations because it's not easy to manage a more bespoke approach to the types of employees that you're engaging with, and how they need to be placed from remote to hybrid to in the office. What we have seen, however, is the blanket statements of you must be in the office 5 days a week seemingly are backfiring on folks because people have learned about themselves and what they need out of their relationship with work. And it isn't, every day in the studio and in the office. And frankly, the data that we're seeing is showing that employee engagement is not increased by being in the office, which is hard for me as an office designer to bring up. But we're also seeing a multitude of new ways of thinking about what the office means and being more purpose-built around the way people need to gather, and just instead of just saying everyone needs to be there for no apparent reason.
Tell us a little bit about what you are therefore doing, that these new ways of thinking and new ways of working are making working life work for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing work across the globe. Some interesting things that we're doing. We're doing a project for ServiceNow, which is a cloud-based technology platform, and part of their new offices is really being designed around the idea of a clubhouse. It has self-sustaining multi-use rooms and breakout rooms and associated catering. And it's really, a portion of the office that's almost being treated like a hospitality suite. And the idea is that it's in support of the team. So teams have the autonomy to decide when and how to utilize the spaces and can, commandeer them for a period of time when they feel that them coming together is useful to the process, but then can go back to a hybrid work environment. So instead of just saying, go back to the office of 2019, we're seeing, the office of 2025 and beyond kind of take shape. And we're seeing more and more interest and energy being put into these kind of programs and spaces that support kind of multi-day summits, events, experiential elements where people come together around the meaning and purpose of an organization, and then kind of can go back to individual work where it suits them. How
do you make an office space with things like, I think you described a self-sustaining multi-use room? How do you make a space ripe for creativity and collaboration and work without making it gimmicky?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the systems that support the space. And that is, we basically talk about supporting the workforce, and the workplace follows that. So, not starting with the design of the space, but in fact, designing the way that you need to support an individual to come to work as their best selves, the way you need to support a team. And so, we're an interdisciplinary studio. So we do, environmental design, but we also do strategy and experiential. We do employee brand and kind of engagement strategies, because a lot of what we're doing is designing kind of rituals around how people come together and support systems. So it's not just designing a room with technology in it, but it's designing a room with technology in it that have the adjacent spaces to it. And it also has a support system that can, rearrange as necessary so that the space truly is adaptable to the team needs, that can bring food in, that can support the team in any way they need support.
David Galulu, thank you so much for joining us on the line from San Francisco. You were The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Just nudging 7:53. We have time to talk culture news now with Monocle senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco, who joins me in the studio. Good morning, Faye.
Good morning, Emma. Great to be here.
Equipped with a very naughty-looking magazine. There's a very vigorous-looking bottom on the front of it.
I love a naughty-looking magazine, I have to say, but this is very good news, by the way. Manchete, which is a Brazilian weekly magazine that ended in 2000, was literally the Brazilian version of Paris Match. Of course, they're not the same, but, it was a mixture of saucy photography, but very in-depth political articles. It was a really kind of revolutionary magazine at the time because they have amazing photojournalism. And the reason I'm talking about it it will return in March. And this really, really surprised me because, as I said, the last printed edition, I believe, was in 2000, so it's been 25 years. And, I'm such a fan, Emma, that even every time I go to Brazil, I buy vintage magazines on websites, on kind of, secondhand shops. And I have an example here for you of a 1991 edition of Manchete. You remember when I mentioned Saucy?
Yes.
There was always a pair of buttocks in the cover.
Excellent. Always?
Oh, well, not always.
Wow.
But at the same time, if you want to read a good interview with a former president, how's the mayor elections in Brazil happening? An exclusive interview of Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was really a variety magazine, if I may say. So I think it's a welcome return to the newsstand.
Two things here. Obviously, something must have changed in order for it to, well, sad that it had a demise in 2000, but what's changed in the Brazilian magazine landscape that's allowed this to make a comeback?
Well, one thing that changes, of course, Manchete, I don't believe they are returning in the usual way as a weekly magazine. I think they're returning as a monthly. They will focus on photojournalism. I believe the first edition that's coming out later in March, there'll be plenty of, carnival stories and amazing photo shoots. But I think the market for premium magazines is really, really doing well in Brazil. Even Elle magazine, they used to publish monthly, but now they publish only 4 times a year. But the issues are beautiful. They're heavy books, it's a very different proposal than what Elle used to be. So I'm glad, of course, it's changing. A lot of magazines had to close down, as in many other countries. But for premium magazines, the market hasn't been better in years.
Indeed, there's space for print, and it's print with ambition. Busy weekend for you. We have the Oscars. I know you're a big fan of that. We have the Caesars, and we also have Carnival. So what are you doing where are you going to divert your energies?
My head is all over the place. I am so excited about everything. We'll start with the Césars, okay? The French Oscars are happening tomorrow. And you know why I'm excited? Not necessarily because of the films that are nominated, but you know who is going to give the opening speech? The wonderful Catherine Deneuve. And we're talking about every time Catherine Deneuve is in the cover of a magazine, I go and buy it. I have a little obsession with her. So I think it'll be fantastic. And it's been a great year for French cinema as well, Emma. Not only in the box office, but I mean, look at the Oscars. Emilia Paré is nominated for 13 categories. The Substance as well, directed by Coralie Farger. So it's been a very good year for French cinema. So you should be watching the Césars tomorrow and the Oscars on Sunday as well. And this one, I'm particularly excited for I'm Still Here, the Brazilian film nominated for 3 categories as well. And Carnival, for God's sake, what am I going to do, Emma?
I don't know. Get a diary. Just staying with the Oscars for a bit, you interviewed Bill Kramer, the CEO of the Academy, and that question had to be asked. It happens every single year. How relevant are the Oscars? How relevant is the Academy? And you heard Bill Kramer fighting hard, but the question does still this comes up year after year after year, which suggests that it's a problem that won't go away.
Well, and I have to say, I believe in the optimism of Bill Kramer because we talk a lot about the ratings. Even though the Oscars last year, there was a little uptick compared to the COVID years, which was quite tough. But the reality is, we all talk about the Oscars. It is relevant. Just look here in the office. We had discussions. Emma, have you seen Conclave? They are relevant and they are becoming international. So people are talking about the Oscars in Brazil because of I'm Still Here. They're talking about the Oscars in Latvia because they have an amazing animation that's been nominated. So yes, we have to look at the ratings, but I think there are other measurements as well to see the success of the Oscars.
Finally, Brazil's Carnival starts this Friday.
Yes, baby. So it's going to be fun.
We started to dance.
Yes, we're starting to dance. And you know what? I wrote something for the Monocle Minute, which I think is a very interesting take for those who don't know much about how Brazil covers Carnival. Global, they traditionally show the samba parades live, and they have a bunch of experts talking about the music, the costumes, really, really the minute detail. But last year they experimented. They invited some influencers to do this coverage. It didn't go well. People hated because those people they might have millions of followers, but they didn't know the names of the samba schools. It was a little bit of a tragedy, but Global, don't worry. They kind of fired all the influencers and the experts are back. I think that's such a great story because people care about Carnival in Brazil. They want to know the details. It's part of our culture.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Laura Kramer, Chris Chris Chermack and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.